Okay, so we're running live. We're going to be talking about consequentialism, um, picking up on our discussion from last time. But what I want to begin with, let's get these going as well. What I want to begin with is some administrative matters. So let's turn to sharing my screen here. Again, hopefully everybody's doing great. Happy Thursday to you. So we don't need that yet. We'll get there. Okay, so here's one of the ethics home pages here. So good. So I've received the assignments already, the first WA, and I'm in the process of grading those. Good chance I'll have those completed by the time I see you again. So hang tight on that. I'm still working on those. And then looks like then I'll be posting an assignment on Saturday. So since I haven't graded all the assignments yet, what I wanted to do was go over the first writing assignment and say a few words about it. So let's get it up here. So I guess officially, I'm going to go ahead and close that assignment. So I won't be accepting any new assignments since I'm going to be talking about it here. The main reason for talking about it is just because you are having a new assignment this weekend, and I want you to have an opportunity to know or get some feedback on the assignment before you start writing a new one, despite the fact that most of you will, just because I'll have the assignments back to you in short order early next week. Okay. So let's then go to the first assignment. Okay. So let's go through these, go through the answers quickly. So number one, according to Thompson's bystander case as discussed in lecture, the right answer is C. That Thompson uses the bystander case specifically to challenge C. Two, according to Thompson's loop case as discussed in lecture, A. So she uses the loop case to challenge famous principle. Three is A and C. Traditional versions of perfectionism are objectivist and pluralist, though there are possible perfectionist views that are monistic, not pluralistic, that could be developed, but traditionally aren't, as I've mentioned in lecture. Four, according to Nazi's experience machine, A, hedonism is challenged. And five, Heathwood argues subjectivism about well-being is true, and desire satisfactionism is a correct theory of well-being, B and C, but not A. He's an objectivist about morality. Okay. Number six, according to the original trolley case, the trolley driver has to decide to kill one or to kill five. Thompson argues that most people she has communicated with about the case claim that the trolley driver must, that is morally required to, kill the one. Thompson ultimately believes that the reason the trolley driver must kill the one is because utilitarianism is true. This is going to be false. So let's see here. I didn't want to do that. I think I got that. Put the key up here. So for 6, I wrote this. Thompson claims that most think that is at least morally permissible, so not morally required or obligatory, to redirect danger away from the 5 to the 1. Moreover, Thompson rejects utilitarianism, even though some might be inclined to think that original trolley supports yet that ethical theory. You could have said something about how Thompson, her running the transplant case is evidence that she's opposed to utilitarianism, or even the footbridge case or some other cases. Okay, so 6 is false. I offer justifications for both reasons why it's false, but sufficient that you offer just one. 7, Brambo claims, that is, believes that Nazi's experience machine argument presupposes a desire satisfaction theory of well-being. This is because Nozick's support for the claim that hooking up to the experience machine is not best for us in terms of well-being is that we wouldn't want to hook up to it. Okay. This is false again. So false, false. My justification here. Bramble argues that even though some have challenged Nozick's experience machine argument, experience machine argument, by claiming it presupposes our satisfactionism, this challenge is false. So even though some have claimed this, that challenge is false. Nozick's discussion of our strong desire not to hook up to the experience machine, according to Bramble, was to provide initial support for the claim that it's not best for us to hook up to the experience machine, not that desire satisfaction was the correct theory of what's best for us. Okay. So Bramble, he doesn't believe that the experience machine presupposes desire satisfaction theory of well-being, and he's at great pains to explain and defend Nozick on this point. Okay, number 8, Heathwood argues that subjectivism about well-being is likely such that it can't be derived from further truths. Accordingly, it is likely a foundational truth. Because of this, Heathwood does not try to prove subjectivism by deriving it from more foundational truths. And this is true. So we have false, false, and then true. So here I've given you the general, so I'm looking for the specific. True. Heathwood uses a concrete case to support subjectivism about well-being precisely because he thinks the latter is a foundational truth. The case he offered involves a fictional man named Charlie, who doesn't care about freedom, even though some would claim that freedom is objectively good for his well-being. Heathwood argues that Charlie's disinterest in freedom supports the claim that it's not good for him. Heathwood then generalizes as a result. Something is good for someone only if they care about it, take interest in it, or desire it. Okay. So true, true, false there. Written response. So 3 short answer questions were 25 points. Basically, it was this 8, 8, and 8, and then everyone got 1 point. Okay. So for number 9, Thompson argues that there's a moral difference between bystander case and transplant case. She claims that her answer involves thinking about rights. Does this mean that the moral difference is explained by Kant's formula of humanity? In other words, does this mean that Thompson's answer involves the moral difference between bystander or transplant case being explained by Kant's formula of humanity? And the answer is going to be no. So number 9, is true that Thompson's solution to the trolley problem. So the solution to the trolley problem is basically an explanation of the moral difference between the bystander case and the transplant case, at least the way Thompson discusses it, one of the ways she discusses it. It's true that Thompson's solution to the trolley problem involves an appeal to the concept of rights, but this does not mean that her solution involves Kant's formula of humanity, at least in part because she shows that Kant's famous moral principle is false using the loop case. But more positively, Thompson argues that it can be permissible to redirect danger from the 1 to the 5 if the means taken to do so doesn't involve a violation of the rights of the 1. So since flipping a switch onto the tracks of the 1 in the bystander case is in itself a rights violation of the 1, it's morally permissible, all things being equal, to kill the 1 in bystander. But since harvesting HP's organs, the healthy patient's organs, in the transplant case doesn't violate HP's or healthy patient's rights, it's wrong to redirect the danger toward him, or does violate HP's rights. It is wrong to redirect the danger toward him, instead of where it was already directed, that is toward the 5 dying patients, the 5 DPs. Okay. 10. So suppose Seema argues that the reason it is morally wrong to kill the portly fella, or Thompson's fat man, in the footbridge case is that portly fella is killed, which in the end violates his right to life. So the wrongness is explained by the wrongness of killing portly fella in the footbridge case is ultimately explained by the fact that his right to life is violated. Would Thompson agree with Seema's claim? Explain. Well, Thompson wouldn't agree with Seema's claim here because it's not going to be that the portly fella's right to life has been violated. That's going to explain the wrongness of killing the portly fella in the footbridge case. So here we go. 10. Thompson disagrees with Seema. Thompson argues that it is sometimes morally permissible to kill the few in order to save the many. in cases where danger can be redirected to the few away from the many instead. So in Footbridge, in the Footbridge case, what explains the moral wrongness of killing Portly Fella is not simply that he was killed for the sake of saving the 5 trolley workers, but because the means taken to kill Portly Fella as a way of redirecting danger to the 1 instead of the 5 intrinsically involves a violation of Portly Fella's rights. That is, one has to push Portly Fella off a footbridge in order to save the 5 workers, but pushing someone off a footbridge is certainly a violation of their rights. So she would ultimately say that it is true that Portly Fella's right to life is violated, but just like in the bystander case, it's going to be true that the one person has his right to life violated. That's not what explains the moral wrongness in the case. In both cases, what's going to be is the fact that the means taken to kill the 1 instead of the 5 in cases of where it's permissible to, in cases where we redirect the danger from the 5 to the 1 or from the many to the few, right? Intrinsically involves a violation of the rights of the individual. So it's that means, right, that's taken to redirect the danger from the many to the 1 or the 5 to the 1. Right? That explains the moral wrongness in the cases. So that way, you could have built off your answer 9 to answer 10. Okay, 11. Suppose Tuan wants a cupcake, but unbeknownst to him, the cupcake is poisonous and will kill him. After explaining why this seems to be a challenge to Heathwood's view of well-being, explain how Heathwood would respond to it in terms of the view of well-being he has. Develop the cupcake case here more in developing your explanation or explanations. Okay. Here we go, number 11. The answer that I wrote was this: Heathwood is a desire satisfaction theorist. So it seems to be a problem for Heathwood that Tuan's fulfilling his desire for the cupcake leads to Tuan's death. But Heathwood thinks that there's a reasonable response open to the desire satisfaction theorist, to wit, Tuan's desire for the cupcake is relevant to his well-being, but it's not the only desire that's relevant. That is, when Tuan's desire for the cupcake is fulfilled, it contributes positively to his well-being, insofar as one of his desires is satisfied. It is not, however, as simple as this. Heathwood argues that we need to keep in mind that Tuan also desires to not get sick and to not die. So it turns out that Tuan's overall well-being is adversely affected by eating the cupcake, because satisfying his desire for the cupcake in turn leads to the frustration of other, more important desires, other weightier desires, presumably the desire to not be killed, desire to not get really sick. Those desires are going to be stronger than a desire to enjoy a cupcake. Okay, so those give you senses of what I was looking for in 9 through 11. Okay, and now number 12. I don't know what happened there, why the numbering went back to 9. I'm going to fix it right now, though, so I don't forget. Good. So, oops, gotta save it. Write an essay capturing Heathwood's view and how he argues for it on the issue of objectivism versus subjectivism with respect to well-being. Moreover, in your essay, explain both why cases of serial killers are problematic for his preferred theory of well-being and how he deals with them. The discussion must include succinct original cases, that is, your own cases, not simply Heathwood's. So when thinking about the problem of serial killers, you should be thinking about the discussion of Ted Bundy. So the original cases would involve developing your own case of the serial killer, whether fictional or not. Of course, you could mention, the Ted Bundy case. That's totally fine to do. It's just that when you, in your essay, at some point or other, when you're responding to the problem of serial killers, you have your own serial killer case in mind. Again, either a fictional case or a real one. Okay, so we know that he's a subjectivist. Heathwood's a subjectivist about well-being. So you'd want to explain what that is in your paper. or in your short essay, again, you only have 300 words, so you need to be nice and concise. So explain what the subjectivism is as opposed to objectivism. Explain, again, Heathwood's subjectivism might be totally fine, even to concisely explain why Heathwood sides with subjectivism. You could develop your own case there, so you're not going to have the Charlie case. You might have Charlie Star case, or you might have your own fictional character, right, or even a real character, and then some other alleged objective good that that character doesn't care about, et cetera, et cetera. So you develop a case that's like the Charlie case, but your own case that captures Heathwood's concrete support for subjectivism. That's totally fine to have done. And then develop the case of serial killers, which seems to be problematic for desire satisfaction theory. So here you could lock in on Heathwood's desire satisfaction theory and say, look, Bundy and or your preferred version, your preferred case of a serial killer, whether fictional or real, involves an individual who has his or her desire satisfied regularly while he's off on murderous rampages. It looks like that's a problem for desire satisfaction theory, subjectivism in general, but at the very least for desire satisfaction theory, because look what the serial killer is doing. The serial killer is satisfying murderous desires. How can that be good? Well, Heathwood, as we know, responds to thinking about the serial killer cases by claiming that it's likely that, or is the case that what we're doing is we're thinking about the serial killer's immoral behavior, which is an objective matter. The serial killers are acting morally wrong in an objective way. And so what we're doing is we're thinking about the objective moral wrongness of the serial killer's behavior, and we're allowing those judgments of moral wrongness to influence, right, to taint our judgments about the well-being levels of the serial killers. So Heathwood would dig in his heels and say, Ted Bundy or some other serial killer, they are living well, or their lives are going well for them in terms of their well-being, right, insofar as their murderous desires are satisfied when they're on their murderous rampages. Okay, but their actions are seriously morally wrong. Okay, so we shouldn't allow our moral judgments to influence, taint, infect our well-being judgments. Okay, so that's how that's what I was looking for in 12. Now, what I'm looking for also are these formal things. Is there an introduction? An introduction, as I explained, needed to be written. In my discussion of this in lecture prior to signing the first WA, needs to be at least 2 body paragraphs, which basically do what the introduction says you're going to do, with smooth transitions between the paragraphs and a conclusion, some kind of concluding insight or a clever, interesting way of summarizing what came before in the essay. So I'm looking for a genuine essay here. It's a 300-word essay, but it's still a genuine essay. Now, when it comes to introductions, I want to say a couple of things about these. So I'm looking for very concise, interesting introductions. So one way in which students are inclined to meet the concision requirement for the introductions is just to say something kind of bland, like, in this paper, I'm going to explain Heathwood's subjectivism and then explain why the case of serial killers is problematic for his preferred view, and then I'm going to conclude with his solution to that problem. So that might be one way in which someone introduces or writes an introduction for a short essay question like this, with a very concise introduction. But that's pretty uninteresting. I know that's what you're going to do generally, just because that's what the prompt is requesting or is requiring of you. So one thing I'd recommend doing is if that's how you want to begin with with begin your essay, if that's how you want your introduction to be, let that be the first draft, right? Introduction. And then after you've written your paper, after you've written the essay, you got your body paragraphs, right? And then you've got your conclusion. Then you know the end from the beginning, so you can go back and you can rewrite the introduction. So oftentimes what will happen is students will write their introduction that's pretty bland and uninteresting. Then they'll write their body paragraphs that correspond with what they said they were going to do in their introduction, and then they don't go back and provide interesting content in their introduction. So what you can do, once you know the end from the beginning, you know what happens in your body paragraphs, and that puts you in a position to, in a very, very concise way, capture what you said in your body paragraphs, right? The key ideas, right? The things that correspond with the, those things that should be your topic sentences, right? So we're talking about essay writing here. We're talking about, you've all taken composition courses. You're in a 300 level philosophy class, so you've taken writing classes, composition courses that teach you how to write essays. So it's expected that you know that in your paragraphs you have topic sentences which organize all the ideas in the paragraphs, the body paragraphs. And so then you have those that will help you, guide you in writing interesting introductions. So that's just some help. If you're struggling with how to have an interesting introduction, allow yourself to maybe have the uninteresting one that just sets out the plan in a pretty bland way based on the prompt. Write your essay and then reflect on what you've done in your essay, right? And boil down what you've done in your essay, the body paragraphs of your essay, and then write that in your conclusion. So your introduction. Your introduction needs to, right, set up the body paragraphs. So what I'm looking for here is also just that that everything ties together like an essay. So it's not just a whole bunch of ideas listed together, even if they're really accurate. I want the writing to be essay-like. It is a 300-word essay, but it still is an essay. Okay, so that's what I'm looking for in these assignments, in these parts of the assignment. Write a genuine essay where you're not just listing off and summarizing, right, the true ideas from lecture discussion that are related to the prompt that I'm asking you about. Okay, so hopefully that's helpful moving forward. Hopefully that helps you with your with the second essay question that you're going to get. There will be at least one short essay question on the next assignment. Now, given that this was your first essay that you've written for me, I take that into account when I am grading the short essay questions. But now that you've written one, you've been given some feedback on them, even if it's generic. I'll give you also specific feedback when I get to your how you wrote your first essay. But now start expecting higher quality essay writing, and keep in mind the second assignment, so WA2, will include at the very least one opinion essay, one argumentative essay. So this is largely, so WA1 largely requires of you the writing of what we might just call a straightforward exegesis essay, where you have to capture Heathwood and get Heathwood right through and through, where your personal mark is made in the essay is in the cases that you develop and the creative way in which you put your essay together. Okay, so I like that, and I encourage you to be creative in the writing of your essays, like you would write in a composition course, but the area for creativity is really developing original cases, at the very least here. In your composition courses, in the courses which you learn how to write essays, presumably you learn how to write an opinion paper or an argumentative essay. So there, what I'll be looking for is less exegesis, less just getting a philosopher right. That will be important, more developing your own views. The argumentative essay that I'll have you write will be one where you'll discuss another philosopher's argument or views in the context of developing yours, responses to theirs. So it won't be develop your own arguments full stop. It'll be develop arguments or an argument or arguments in response to arguments that you've studied in the unit that we're covering on the writing assignment. So if you have any questions, any further questions about how to write an opinion paper, an argumentative style essay, be sure to ask me before the second WA is due, but that'll be assigned again with WA2 itself will be assigned, that is on this coming Saturday. Any questions or comments I can deal with before moving on? Now that we've covered the administrative stuff. Okay. Good. All right, so let's dive back into what we've been talking about content-wise for the course. We've been talking about consequentialism, and the William Shaw paper has been our guide in that unit, but I do break from it in certain places, or at least branch off from it more accurately. So remember consequentialism. Let's go up. We know what the view is. Let's just make sure we have it. So maybe we'll just maybe use this one. Consequentialism is the moral theory, ethical theory, claiming that the morally right action in any scenario is to promote good consequences overall. Okay. And we remember that consequentialism is, right, it tends to be a maximizing view, but it can be a satisficing view. Meaning that we think about promoting good consequences, either we have to bring about the best consequences or we have to bring about good enough consequences. Hopefully that's helpful. Hopefully we understand the difference between maximizing on the one hand, satisficing on the other. That takes some getting used to, because I know satisficing isn't a term that we ordinarily encounter in English. Okay, we remember that there's a very strong connection and dependence for consequentialism of its value theory on the normative theory. Sorry, of the normative theory on the value theory. Did I say that right? Yeah. Of the normative theory on the value theory is what I meant to say if I didn't say it right the first time. Sorry about that. So that strong relation is cashed out in terms of universality and necessity. And I have bulleted here on this slide what that amounts to. It's necessary, meaning it must be the case that so that's the universality claim, every morally right action is determined by the good consequences it brings about. Okay, so it's a very, very strong view in that way. And we know what value theory is by now. Okay, putting everything together, remember consequentialism is a normative moral theory, a theory of right and wrong action. It can be a theory of right and wrong action that depends, remember, that strong, essential, and necessary, essential and universal way on a value theory. It's a normative moral theory maintaining that the primary fundamental moral obligation is to bring about intrinsically good consequences overall. So remember, when we work out a value theory, you want to know it's intrinsically good. Okay, so many of the consequentialists they give an account of what's intrinsically good, conversely, what's intrinsically bad, and then they develop their normative theory, which is just basically saying, remember those things that I claimed earlier were intrinsically valuable? Okay, we have an obligation always to bring those things about, and necessarily to bring those things about. And then, of course, it's wrong to bring about the bad things. That's hopefully that's thinking about the converse case is quite simple. And then again, a normative moral theory that's consequentialism is a normative moral theory that's universally necessarily dependent on its value theory. Well, this is all by way of recap. So consequentialism entails that at least some outcomes are agent neutral. Okay, at least some good outcomes are agent neutral, meaning they don't depend on any perspective. So we could say, for example, that the good consequences in the original trolley case involve saving the 5 and killing the 1, full stop, without having to say from the perspective of the 5. Okay, from the perspective of the 5 qualification isn't something that we need in order to evaluate whether or not the good consequence in the case is to save the 5, kill the 1. Okay. Okay. And remember, so with respect to the good outcomes, there's agent neutrality, but also with respect to right action, right? The fundamental principle of consequentialism, however it gets developed, however it gets defined, is going to end up being agent neutral. So we can understand agent neutrality with respect to the value theory, to the value component of consequentialism, but also with respect to the normative component of consequentialism. Consequentialism is a normative theory, but remember, it's essentially dependent and it's essentially and universally dependent on its value theory. The way in which consequentialism is fundamentally agent neutral is just that the fundamental normative claim, promote goodness, promote the good, however that ends up getting defined, is itself agent neutral, meaning there's no relativization to any particular or any group of agents. So any particular agent or any group of agents, more exactly. There's no essential reference to any agent or group of agents, is the way I put it in this on this slide. This is all by way of recap. I know that some of the stuff was a bit abstract initially, but I'm hoping that by saying it again, it's helping these concepts sink in. Okay. And if there were any questions about what it meant for, right, a duty to be, or for a right action to count as agent relative, think about the mom trolley case again, right? So it is right for the person in the trolley to kill the 5, right, and save the 1 because the 1 is, right, the mother of the person who's driving in the trolley. So there we need to make a central reference or central relativization to a specific agent. Okay, the person who's the son of the person who's the son of the 1, the 1 trolley worker in the mom trolley case. Okay, so that's what excuse me it looks like, what it would look like to say that a right action or a duty or an obligation, etc., is agent relative in that way. Excuse me again. So remember that consequentialism is also a theory whereby the theory of goodness that they have in their value theory, or good consequences that they have developed in their value theory, is independent of the theory of rightness. The reason for this is because they want to try to explain rightness in terms of goodness or in terms of good consequences. And so if part of goodness or part of good consequences involve the notion of rightness, then we'd have a partially circular understanding or explanation of rightness. And we know that explanatory or circular explanations, right, at least at first glance, they're not explanatory. Okay, or the degree to which an explanation is circular is the degree to which it is not explanatory. Might be another way of explaining the problem with of trying to claim, if one were try to do this, to try to claim that part of the good consequences are right actions. Remember, we're trying to explain right actions in terms of the good consequences. Okay, then there's a slogan that goes with consequentialism. It goes with other normative theories, as we're going to see later in the term. But the good is prior to the right. So this is a way of capturing the way in which the value theory is essential and universally related to the normative theory. Okay, the good is sort of standing in for value theory, and then the right is standing in for the normative theory, which consequentialism is. Okay. But it also can capture this independence idea that that when we think about good consequences, the good consequences are independent of right actions. Okay, so we can understand the slogan in a couple of different ways that might be helpful. The good is prior to the right. The good is logically prior to the right. The good is theoretically prior to the right. Okay, and sometimes the way I like to put it is just straightforward, like you're a consequentialist. You might begin logically, theoretically, with saying, oh, here's my theory of intrinsic goodness, theory of intrinsic badness, and then I associate those with consequences, right? Good consequences, bad consequences, and then my consequentialist theory is just going to say, bring about, maximize or satisficing, or maximize or satisfice, right? Those intrinsically good consequences, and then avoid bringing about those intrinsically bad consequences. Okay, that were again worked out in the value theory in advance. We remember that consequentialists, they tend to go expected utility or expected consequences that matter when they work out their theory. And this is just because the consequentialists want to maintain that that the world can, in many cases, at least some cases, not cooperate with agents who are deliberating about what to do as they try to figure out what the best outcomes are. What the best outcomes are in relation to their actions. And so the consequentialist, at least in many cases, wants to say, okay, given that the world doesn't oftentimes cooperate, then so long as someone has made all the right predictions and acted in accordance with the probabilities, as it were, the high probabilities, the best probabilities, then they've acted morally correctly, even if it turns out that the probabilities, which were high, ultimately failed them because something improbable happened. Yeah. And we talked about how there's different ways in which agents could make the relevant predictions. Sometimes that's taking pencil to paper and getting out the calculator and working out the outcomes. In other cases where one has to act quickly, right? They're thinking about what moral rule tends to hold, what moral rule tends to bring about, right, the most good, or tends to bring about the best outcomes, or what moral rule is probabilistically preferable. But then, of course, then the world could produce an improbable, right, outcome. Okay. So those who go actual with respect to the consequences, those who say that it's not the expected outcomes that matter when it comes to the moral worth of an action, those who say that it's the actual consequences that do, they're going to say, well, if the world doesn't cooperate, right, if that which is improbable, right, happens, we're still going to say that the person who performed the action following that which was probabilistically preferable in terms of outcomes, they did wrong, right? Or they didn't do good enough, or some such, right? So there you go. So I have here, on this slide, a kind of very simplified action theory whereby there are these antecedents of action, which this could be more involved, obviously. It could be like, someone has certain, desires and beliefs about how to satisfy their desires, and then they deliberate about the best way of satisfying their desires, and then they deliberate about whether they should bring about their desire. You see, they do the pro con thing, and then they arrive at a decision on that front at the end of their deliberation process. They have to form a decision, and then that leads to an intention, right? They form an intention, and then they perform the action, and then the action, of course, is going to have consequences. All those all seem to be relevant to human action. Okay. Okay, and keep in mind, like, what the consequentialist is doing. This might be a big, helpful big picture point here. What the consequentialist is doing is saying, like, look, when we look at the moral status of an action, we're looking at this aspect of action, right? So we have all these things, these antecedents of action, a whole range of things that are relevant to action in terms of being antecedently, at least logically antecedently relevant to action. And then you have the action itself, the movement of the body guided by the intention or some such is going to be the action. And then the consequences of the action. And in trying to figure out a theory of like right action, the consequentialist says, I'm going to locate the correctness of an action right here. The moral correctness of an action is going to be found in thinking about this aspect of an action, or this intimately related aspect of an action right here, the consequences of the action, you see? And then if the consequentialist goes actual in their theory, then it's going to be the actual consequences that determine the moral significance of the action in question by the agent. And then if the theorist goes expected, then it's going to be the expected consequences, okay, that determine the moral status of the action, whether the action is right, permissible, wrong, etc. Okay. And of course, to be a non-consequentialist just means that, or at least one way of thinking about it, is that something other than the consequences, perhaps the action itself, perhaps the reason for acting, perhaps the intention for action, perhaps the facts related to deliberation, etc. Perhaps the character, which is central to all of the antecedents of action, are relevant. Right? They're going to say some other thing. Perhaps it's a multiplicity of things. Perhaps it's the consequences in some cases, but not all cases. So sometimes it's the consequences, sometimes it's the reason for acting, right? Sometimes it's the character which leads to the reason for acting, etc. Right? That determines the moral status of an action. So there's, as you can see in logical space, many different ways of going here. But to be an anti-consequentialist, to be a non-consequentialist, one just has to deny that in every case, it's necessarily the case that that the consequences, whether actual or expected, determine the moral status of the action. That's all that's needed, right? At least sometimes, in some cases, the correctness of an action isn't the moral status of an action, more neutrally put. Right? It's determined by something other than the actual expected consequences of the action. Okay. I remember we talked about how expected utility works. And I use utility just because the most common form of consequentialism is we're going to see is utilitarianism, and they talk in terms of utility or happiness. Sometimes utility is just used very generally. That doesn't really have to do with happiness, but benefit. And the benefit gets defined in various ways as happiness or pleasure, desire, satisfaction. You see how this could go? So sometimes utility is used generically in the literature. Economists seem to use utility generically in their work. Okay. Okay, so let's now turn then to utilitarianism. So the most common form of consequentialism is utilitarianism. That's been noted many times now. The slogan, if we're to give utilitarianism a slogan, would be promote the happiness of all. So here we've just taken goodness and defined it as the happiness of all. Now, typically, utilitarians will say something like that the clearest case of goodness in terms of working out a value theory and perhaps maintaining that the value theory just reduces to the theory of well-being, a theory of what's good for us, right? Is just a theory about how individual happiness is what's intrinsically good, right? So that seems to be the easiest case, right? Most utilitarians would be fine saying that the individual happiness is intrinsically good for the person who has it, the person who's happy. Intrinsically good for us in terms of our well-being. And then from there, sometimes what they'll do is they'll say, but if individual happiness is intrinsically good for the person who has it, then we can perform some like aggregate function and say, well, then the happiness of all, right, or general happiness, right, is good for it's good for the whole. It's good for the aggregate. So we think about the individual and think about individual happiness. My happiness, your happiness is maybe examples of individual happiness. We say, intrinsic goodness, right? Intrinsic goodness in terms of the well-being, right? In those cases, right? And then we take general happiness, that the happiness of the aggregate, right? So my happiness, your happiness, and then we'll take the set of everyone's, right? That's the aggregate, thinking about it that way. And then we move from the claim that that since my individual happiness is good for me, intrinsically good for me, and your happiness is intrinsically good for you, then the happiness of the aggregate or the general happiness is intrinsically good for the whole, intrinsically good for the aggregate. And that's just happiness of all. Okay, so that kind of argument you see in John Stuart Mill's work when he tries to move from the claim that, or when he tries to move to the claim that the happiness of all is what's relevant in a utilitarian theory, right? It's not just promote one's individual happiness that matters, it's simply promoting everyone's happiness, promoting general happiness, but how does one move from the easy case of individual happiness being intrinsically good to the aggregate happiness being intrinsically good? Well, some kind of argument I just gave a moment ago. Now, some might just even avoid trying to run an argument and just say, I'm just going to begin with the claim that general happiness is intrinsically good for the whole, right? Something like that. Or happiness is good. Happiness of all is intrinsically good. It's an intrinsically good state of affairs in the world. Something like that. That's just where they might begin. I was trying to just give you a kind of argument that's in the literature by a prominent utilitarian, John Stuart Mill, right, for the claim that the happiness of all is intrinsically good. Okay, so that's where utilitarians begin. Now think about it like this: like you have the consequentialist view, and I've mentioned this earlier in the course, but it may not have made a ton of sense because I was saying it in the context of an introduction to the course. But with consequentialism, there are views which focus on just the individual good being promoted. So when it's claimed by the consequentialist theory that our fundamental obligation is to promote goodness or promote the good, some egoists could come in and say that, well, it's my individual goodness that's at issue, right? Or they're going to define the goodness in terms of what's good for me, what we might call, egoistic goods. But now think about what the utilitarian does. Is utilitarian defines goodness not as singular, individual, or egoistic goods, but as the good of all. Okay, and the utilitarian says defines as good as happiness, happiness of all. Now, in logical space, there's a huge gap between these possibilities, right? You don't really see any views that developed in between, right, or within the gap region where we consider these in logical space. But it is open, in logical space to develop a view which doesn't take either extreme. It's just traditionally the way things have historically gone. One goes egoistic or one goes anti-egoistic and goes universal with respect to the goodness claim. Okay, that's central to a consequentialist theory. Okay, that's just a sort of a theoretical point that I thought was worth mentioning. So promote in the case of traditional versions of utilitarianism, promote is defined in terms of maximization, maximize the happiness of all. Okay, so, but one could be a satisficer and say, bring about enough happiness of all, or bring about a satisfactory amount of happiness for all, even if maximizing the happiness of all is too demanding or some such. Goodness is defined as happiness of all. We already know that. And then here's just a way of capturing utilitarianism a bit beyond the slogan form. Utilitarianism is the moral theory maintaining that the fundamental normative obligation is to promote the happiness of all. So the fundamental normative obligation is to promote the happiness of all. So the fundamental normative obligation for consequentialism was to promote good, promote the good, promote goodness, etc. Utilitarianism, right, further refines that. And remember, promote can be defined in one of two ways: maximizing or satisficing. So if you were to go like the John Stuart Mill route, again, a famous 19th century British utilitarian, he would say, maximize the happiness of all. Right? The greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of individuals. And by individuals, he meant all sentient beings. So utilitarians tend to be universal in that way. Every sentient being is going to matter. Every sentient being, every being that's capable of experiencing happiness. I should note that for Mill, happiness was understood in terms of enjoyable experiences or pleasant experiences. So this way he was a hedonist. But one doesn't have to be a hedonist, okay? In order to be utilitarian, it's just one way of being a hedonist, or one way of being a utilitarian, excuse me. Okay. So Mill was a hedonistic utilitarian, but one could be an anti-hedonistic utilitarian. They think happiness isn't to be defined in terms of pleasure. So one's a hedonist was a hedonistic utilitarian when they define happiness in terms of pleasure, or pleasant experiences, enjoyment experiences, and the like. Okay. Okay, so I want to say some things about how utilitarianism relates to moral rules, okay, to moral codes. So maybe I'll begin with I had a Word document up here. Let's see if I can find it. Oh, there it is. So in the context of Mill, so you can just set aside the Mill here. So here's a toy structure of utilitarian moral system of principles. So you've got the fundamental principle. So this is a fundamental principle, or the absolute principle. Sometimes it's called. So Peter Singer, he's a contemporary utilitarian thinker. He says there's one absolute principle. It's this. Okay. And certainly John Stuart Mill would agree with it. And so Mill, I did say set aside the Mill, but here I kind of expand on the Mill a little bit in a way to provide just kind of an example of what a utilitarian system could look like, or the toy structure of a utilitarian moral system of principles or moral rules. So when you think about principles, be thinking about, rules, moral system of principles or rules. Okay, so you've got the fundamental or absolute principle, and then from it, principles of justice are derived. Right, this is one possible way of going. So these are going to be derived principles. They're relatively absolute. And that's one way of thinking about it. They're not quite absolute, but they're pretty close. What makes these principles relatively absolute is just that they're the principles that, if lived up to, they are the most likely to promote the happiness of all. Okay, or they're the principles that are most closely associated with promoting the happiness of all. Supposing we live up to these principles. And so what might some of these principles of justice look like? The right to life, the right to security, the right to freedom of expression, the right to property, the right to privacy, the right to fair treatment, etc. Okay, and then the idea from here is, well, you got a bunch of principles. You follow these, right? You follow these principles, or you live up to these rights, you respect these rights. And then this principle gets satisfied. The utilitarian principle gets satisfied. Sometimes it's just called the utility principle. Okay. So the utilitarian theory gives us one fundamental principle. You might think that that's all there is to the theory, is that one principle, but that's just not quite precise. It's like that principle is a principle that guides us in our developing other principles, and so then we end up with these derived principles. So in this way, then the utilitarian can say, look, we needn't go around doing this onerous calculating everywhere we go before we figure out whether or not our action is going to count as permissible or as right or as wrong, as the case may be. Okay. So oops, the wrong way there. I want to get to the problems with consequentialism in a moment. I want to do some further work here. So I want to show how utilitarianism is related to a view that is oftentimes commonly accepted by undergraduates that I've come in contact with who have taught. And that view is known as moral relativism. Okay. And so let's see here. What did I do with my moral relativism document? Is it here? No. Oh, I know I put it. It's up here. Put it in a. Good. I put it in a PDF. So we had been talking about how utilitarianism, and then last time we talked about how consequentialism more generally can deal with the idea of there being moral rules. And I talked about moral rules last time in the context of a moral code. Okay, I was kind of anticipating some of the discussion I was going to come this time. So let's just begin with the idea of a moral code and let that set up the notion of, or the theory of, moral relativism. Okay, to get precise on what that view amounts to. I think it will be one that you're probably readily familiar with. You thought about at some point or other in your theorizing. Right? However implicit that theorizing has been. Okay, so here's an example of a possible moral code. Okay, and this is different than the the set of principles that I developed here, right, on this in this document, because here I'm thinking about how someone like Mill or anyone who holds the utilitarian principle, how they might go about deriving further principles, or how they might claim that these very salient principles to us in our experiences could be related to the utilitarian principle. Presumably, these principles of justice for Mill, which involve just thinking about moral rights, right? A bunch of them listed here, right? How they could be related to, right, utilitarianism. And it's that the utilitarian, all things being equal, is going to have to say that these, right, very, very important principles, very important rights, which us in our experience, how they can be related to utilitarianism by way of being derived from utilitarianism. And the derivation will play an explanatory role, a justifying role, perhaps, right? So the utilitarian thinks that she can explain why the right to life is so important, because when we live up to the right to life, when we honor it and respect it enough through our daily living, we contribute to the happiness of all. We contribute to it being promoted and brought about, right? Okay. Now here, I'm just thinking about a moral code generally, and I'm thinking that this is a very simple moral code, one that might capture in small part what our moral code looks like, or at least what some of our moral codes looks like, right? The moral code for some of us might look like. Or some, like maybe this is an overlap of quite a few of our moral codes where we find intersection and agreement on the things that would belong in a moral code, our moral code. So the basic norms, so avoid harm, don't kill. So the basic norm is avoid harm. And the way in which you avoid harm is by avoiding lying, cheating, torturing, robbing, and killing. In the way that you do good. So doing good is a basic norm. And the way in which we do good is we help others when they're in need. We're honest in our dealings with each other. We protect property. We preserve life. And it's perfectly consistent with our moral code that we think that these hold really 99.9% of the time. Okay, 1% of the time, or 0.1% of the time, we'll say don't, right? Because we find ourselves in trolley situations. We find ourselves starving to death and have to rob someone because no one will give us bread, right? There's a ticking bomb terrorist who has a bomb about to go off in Central Park in New York, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The Nazis are at your door asking if you're hiding any Jews. You are, right? 1940s. Right? Seems like we should lie. Okay. So there's no claim in accepting a moral code that you have to be committed to the principles on the moral code holding always necessarily, admitting of no counterexamples, right? Okay. A moral code needn't have that built into it. Some may want to have that built into their moral code. They can argue for it. Okay, they can argue for it. Okay. We also think that part of a moral code is that there's going above and beyond what we're required to do. Going above and beyond what we're required to do, going above and beyond what duty calls. So going beyond duty, going beyond the call of duty, sometimes we might say. And we call these actions or these aspects of our moral code the heroic principles, the heroic actions, the supererogatory. Okay, the supererogatory. So we think about the erogatory, we're thinking about the obligatory, we're thinking about duty, and then super is beyond duty, greater than duty. So these heroic principles would involve like helping as many people as one can, sacrificing one's own life for others. And the famous example is, the military person jumping on the grenade, right, to save his fellow troops, to save 5 or 10 of his fellow troops, something like that, right? Okay, so this is a pretty intuitive, moral code. And then we might think there's moral education aspects to our moral code, teach youth about the moral code. Right? We want the youth to know what's right and wrong, instill habits of action in accordance with the moral code, and instill moral emotions, moral responses in accordance with the moral code. This would all be part of moral education. We've all been through it. Okay, we all go through it. Maybe when we become of age, we start to question our moral code, maybe aspects of our moral code. Perhaps we just focus on certain salient aspects of our moral code that we want to question, we want to challenge, even though we're fairly unreflective about the vast majority of it. That sometimes happens. But those who are more reflective might think about more aspects of the moral code. Anyways, it's just a sample moral code that one might be inclined to accept in our society. Okay. Now, if we're to model moral relativism, right? Way of doing so is to think about there's all these different moral codes. Moral code 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, moral code to the end. All these different moral codes, right? And A, B, C, B, C, D, A, C, D, B, D, E. Those are all just variables, and they represent the basic norms. Okay, like the ones we had listed up above over here. But the idea is just that moral code is different from moral code 1 is different from moral code 2 because there's going to be some principle, some moral rule, moral code 2 that's not in moral code 1, or some aspect of moral code 2 that's going to be different from moral code 1. And the same thing can be said for these other moral codes. I'll try to capture the difference by providing different variables. Okay? And then, so there's not a complete overlap of the basic moral norms, moral rules. Right? There's no perfect overlap between 5 and any of the others, right? 4 and any of the others, 3 and any of the others, 2 and any of the others, and 1 and any of the others, okay? So a moral relativistic view isn't one that just says, oh, there are these different moral codes with these different moral norms. The moral relativist says that what is right, morally speaking, what is wrong, morally speaking, right? What is heroic, morally speaking, is determined entirely by the moral code that one subscribes to. And oftentimes the moral code is going to be associated with a culture 1, culture 2, culture 3, culture 4, culture 5, or society 1, society 2, society 3, society 4, etc., right? So the moral relativist claim isn't just a claim about there being diverse, widespread and diverse moral codes, or diverse, widespread sets of moral beliefs. Is a claim about what counts as morally right, what counts as morally wrong in relation to those codes. So there's no moral code, as it were, that serves as the moral code by which we can evaluate these other moral codes. They're just these individual moral codes, and that's it. So this is moral code 1 is, let's just say, culture 1, which is just basically captured by what we had discussed above. That's our moral code. Right? The moral code 5 is, let's say, the moral code that we find in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, the mid-1930s, after Hitler's had a good run for a little while. You see? Now, if moral relativism is true, then there's just the moral code, and that term is right, wrong, and heroic. So, could count as right to treat certain marginalized groups in that society as if they're not even human. And that's right. At the very least, permissible, according to moral relativism, of course. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying according to moral relativism. You see? And for many, that's a reductio ad absurdum. That's absurd. It's absurd that a moral theory like moral relativism could imply that someone could treat someone as if they're not even human, right? As many Nazis treated, say, Jews, for example, in the mid-1930s in Germany. You see? So all this is just to say that moral relativism is this very strong claim, not just that there's these different moral codes, but that individual moral codes themselves determine what's morally right, what's morally wrong, what's morally heroic, etc. Okay? So then, how does this relate to consequentialism? Well, consequentialism would be a moral view that would allow us to go in and do the evaluative work. So when we say that, according to the consequentialist, according to the utilitarian, let's think about the utilitarian, right? When the utilitarian says there's one absolute, one fundamental moral principle, and that is the principle, promote the happiness of all. Well, then that principle could be used to assess moral codes in an objective way, you see? So the consequentialist view, the utilitarian view, it is a consequentialist view, of course, right? The utilitarian view is able to develop a theory that goes against moral relativism. It's an anti-relativistic view. Okay? Because it's in the best case scenario for the consequentialist, we're going to get some preferable, dare I say, ideal moral code that drops out of thinking about the absolute fundamental principle of utilitarianism, you see? And on the basis of that, preferable or ideal, or just maybe more ideal moral code that we are able to arrive at by thinking about the utilitarian principle, the consequentialist principle more generally. Right? We're able to evaluate moral codes and say, this one goes wrong, that one goes wrong. Moral code 5 goes really wrong because you don't promote the happiness of all by exterminating entire races of people or attempting to exterminate entire races of people, etc. You see? So I'm trying to provide some context. So it doesn't just seem so abstract. A, and then B, I do think that many undergraduate students coming into an ethics course might have leanings toward a kind of moral relativism. And this is to get you to see like how a consequentialist view or utilitarian view would respond, and to see also exactly what moral relativism commits one to. Yeah. Do you want, as a moral relativist, supposing you are one, or does the person who professes to be a moral relativist really want to commit oneself to saying that there's no objective factor that matters to whether it was right to exterminate Jewish people in the 1930s and 40s in Germany, because purely determined by moral code 5 here that we've sketched? Okay. All right, so I'll stop there at that. And then turn my attention to problems with consequentialism. One problem we've already anticipated is the first one. So we're thinking about just consequentialism here, but these are going to apply to thinking about utilitarianism as well, because utilitarianism is a kind of consequentialism. So it seems that there are some fundamental agent-relative principles. But remember, the fundamental principles for consequentialism, for utilitarianism, those principles are agent-neutral. They're agent-neutral all the way down, right, or to the core. Okay? We've already seen this. Perhaps it's a fundamental moral obligation that we care for our loved ones more than we care for strangers, as is seen by thinking about the mom trolley case, yeah? Now, the consequentialist has to say, no, you caring for your loved ones over strangers is a moral principle that we, at best, would derive from the agent-neutral fundamental principle of consequentialism or utilitarianism, depending on how we go with our consequentialism, you see? So that's where debate could be had, okay? Consequentialism seems too demanding, at least as far as we're thinking about the maximizing versions of consequentialism. That's an important point to note here. Or utilitarianism seems too demanding then. We're thinking about the maximizing versions of the theory. Maximize the happiness of all, right? that seems to mean that what we have to do is bring about the best overall consequences. But doing the best, right, seems to mean that there's no such thing as a supererogatory. The supererogatory gets crowded out. Right? Seems like it's part of our common ordinary moral thinking that there's the obligatory and the permissible on the one hand, and then there's also the supererogatory, the heroic on the other, sacrificing your own life. We tend to think that nobody's obligated to do that, or at least not ordinarily, at least not across most cases. Okay. It would be heroic beyond the call of duty for someone to sacrifice their own life to save some people. Right? Again, at least across a wide range of cases. But if consequentialism, if utilitarianism is true, then it looks like common sense morality is wrong, and that seems to be a mark against these maximizing views of consequentialism, utilitarianism, because the supererogatory gets X'd out. And everything in morality just becomes about what's obligatory and what's permissible. Perhaps what's obligatory, right? You're required to do what's best, but isn't it best in some cases to sacrifice yourself? Okay. So what you're thinking about this idea is just that the supererogatory gets crowded out, and we can raise the bar all the way up to the top to where there's only the obligatory left. And there's no such thing as a heroic anymore. What you thought was heroic, what you thought was supererogatory, according to maximizing versions of consequentialism, utilitarianism, turn out to be obligatory after all. But now it looks like morality is extremely demanding. Okay. Okay, we have these last two objections, and they involve thinking about deontological or duty-based permissions and constraints. I haven't talked enough about what duty-based deontological permissions and constraints are yet. We're turning to deontology or duty-based ethics next time. So why don't we talk about deontology and duty-based ethics first, and then circle back to these last two problems with consequentialism. Okay, so I'll go ahead and stop there now. I think we're over time, so I'll stop here. Are there any questions or comments, concerns you have about anything? If not, then I'll go ahead and bid you a great night, bid you a great weekend. Again, I'll be posting the second writing assignment by 5 p.m. on Saturday. If you have any questions about how to write that essay, how to fine-tune that introduction in a way I'm looking for, how to get more concise with your writing so that way you can meet the 300-word minimum well without having to go too far over, focusing exactly on the prompt, let me know. Any other questions, feel free to come office hours, send me an email. Otherwise, be in touch with me, all right? Be well and have a great night. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.